5:10, 5:15. Is that okay? Can you be patient? And we'll give some folks to come out of class time to make it over as well. Thank you so much. I apologize. Appreciate you.
Hello. Hi. Welcome, everyone. So we have a little transportation difficulty now that I think has something to do with the rain and the location. So we are going to start, and our fellow panelists, Kianga Yamada-Taylor and Marc Lamont Hill, will join us as we proceed, at some point as we proceed through the conversation. But we didn't want to leave you all waiting any longer because we have a finite period of time. So this evening is an opportunity for us to talk about race, politics, and also the 3 extraordinary books that have come out this year from my colleague, Professor Glaude, Democracy in Black, How Race Enslaves the American Soul, from Marc Lamont Hill, Nobody, Casualties of America's War on the Vulnerable, and from Professor Taylor, From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation. Each work has a different focus, but they're all written with this laser-like attention to the problem of domination, the violence of white supremacy, and the black political imagination as we struggle against both. So we'll start with a 2-person conversation. I'm going to start with a question that I do hope that we get to explore with all of our panelists, but this is actually a question that I've asked you recently. And I want to begin with it because I think it can help us orient our conversation. You all may know that we tend to receive a lot of backlash for taking positions that are critical of the Democratic Party or black political establishment, the president, candidate Clinton, etc. And oftentimes I think the backlash isn't simply that people don't want to have their ideas about these figures challenged, but actually that people misperceive the impetus behind the critiques, what it is that drives them. Sometimes the charges we get are naivete, envy, emo even. And instead of sort of entering the conversation with what are often a set of presumptions about, a misperception about where we're coming from, I actually want to start by asking, what are the core values that animate the positions that you take in public life? What's the ideological underpinning? What are the political commitments, the values that shape how you assess what you see out in the world?
Well, thank you. We're here to celebrate, the publication of these important books. Mm-hmm. But we also want to give you credit and due, and thank you for your brilliance and the work that you do. Particularly the importance of More Beautiful and More Terrible to my own thinking on this matter. So the animating values kind of are grounded in a preoccupation with the most vulnerable, the people who reside in the shadows, with the people who are trying to forge and eke out a living on the underside or the underbelly of American life and around the globe. So the first order of consideration for me rests with how might a particular political position or a particular political personality affect the life chances of those particular folks. Mm-hmm. And so that's a very particular way of rendering the claim. And then all of that is animated by a broader concern or consideration for issues of justice and love as animating principles for how we ought to orient ourselves to each other. And when I talk about justice, I don't mean something in the abstract. I don't mean some kind of procedural notion, right? I'm thinking about justice as a form of non-domination, right? And that is standing in right relation with one's fellows. Right. Mm-hmm. How do we stand in right relation to one another? And how do we evidence the forms of mutuality that's required to constitute a form of life that is reflective of our deepest aspirations, that occasion the opportunity for not only people to dream dreams, but to make those dreams a reality. So an attentiveness to the least of these, right, is the point of entry, is what I'm always keeping track of, or the most vulnerable among even the least of these.
Right.
And then the broader consideration or concern for the question of justice and love, right, as the animating values,
right,
for how we ought to think of politics. What about yourself? What do you think? What are the animating values that drive how you?
I mean, I do think, I mean, at core, it's a commitment to my position against domination, right? This commitment to not being, I mean, it's consistent with what you're saying, right relation. The way that finds its footing for me is often in critiques of patriarchy, critiques of white supremacy, and of capitalism. So I think, so while there's in some ways a tension between, because I conceive of myself as someone who believes in socialist principles, who thinks that there is something fundamentally indecent about the depth of economic inequality that has shaped our entire history in this nation, right? I also have a fundamental commitment to democracy. And that means that, I think of that in response to what you're saying, because I think, when you're talking about being in right relation with others, that also entails not insisting upon your account of the world in order to be in political community,
Say more about that. What do you mean?
Well, so not that many socialists in this country, right?
12 million voted for one, though.
That's true. Well, not
Not
a New
really
Deal
a
Democrat.
yeah, not really a
not a
socialist.
real socialist. But
Yeah.
yeah. So so I think I think there's a tension there, and for me, what that means is that part of what I consider my life's work to be is providing an account of the world that I think can be compelling and resonate with others, to move people towards an understanding that resists the ways, all of these sorts of things, exploitation, right? The imperative of constant competition with each other, the drive towards accumulation, and also all the other isms, right, that go along with domination. Yeah.
But it's really funny, though. I find myself all the time in these sorts of spaces where I'm critical of, say, Hillary Clinton.
Right.
And the moment in which I voice that criticism, I'm often accused of being complicit with the election of Donald Trump. Or
Immediately.
Yes.
Right.
It happened this morning. I was on Morning Joe this morning, and Joe was in a tizzy, Scarborough, that is, was in a tizzy about the front page story on the New York Times, in the New York Times and in the Washington Post about the Clinton Foundation, where there was a direct correlation between, or some direct connection between, the raising of funds for the foundation and the personal gain of the Clintons, particularly of Bill Clinton. And he asked me a question. He asked me about my opinion of this, and I said it reflects a moral and ethical deficit. And immediately, I got trashed, right? As if I was supposed to, in some ways, defend it, which I think is indefensible. That's the one thing. And two, as if in order to balance the critique of Clinton, I immediately had to point to the fact that Trump was worse, right? And without making that move, then I only had there were only one or two options to describe what I was doing. And that's trashing Clinton or being complicit with the election of Donald Trump. And in both of those instances, I think it is a complete assault on how we should be deliberating in this political season and how we should be thinking of ourselves as political actors. But it's hard to do that when you have this sort of demand.
Right. And I think it's important to remember this demand happens every election season, right? So there's a particularly heinous candidate this season, but it's not as though the sense of moral panic around what will happen, right, if someone is elected, is consistent, right? Happens every single season. So, I want you to unpack it a little bit more, because you've talked about the contracted scope of the American political landscape, right? The rightward shift of the Democratic Party, the way that Democrats have been complicit in the evacuation of the public sector, right, have moved away from aggressive advocacy for the least of these. And yet, right, so I think that's something worth fleshing out. And then there's also the problem of a black custodial politics, which is a get out the vote machine that you write about, right? So that there's a piety, there's a sense of moral obligation to serve a party that is consistently moving to the right, and not advocating precisely according to the values that you and I both asserted our principles, right?
Yeah. So, today it's hard to even imagine Walter Mondale, a Democrat like him.
Right.
Some of you don't even know who the hell that is. But Walter Mondale would be radical
today, right?
In this moment, because what you've had is, in effect, the Democratic Leadership Council shift the spectrum, right? That is to say, the spectrum of American politics now runs from center right to the far right. So much so that someone like John Kasich is considered moderate. And those of us who grew up in the 1990s, right, understood Kasich as part of Newt Gingrich's henchmen, right, and was in fact considered a crazy in the 1990s. So what we've seen is a kind of narrowing of the bandwidth, right, of what constitutes American politics. Look, not only has that happened, the result has been devastating. Republicans didn't pass the crime bill.
Right.
Sign it. The Republicans didn't sign welfare reform. Republicans didn't dismantle Glass-Steagall.
Right.
Right. All of this happened on the watch of Democrats. And that Saturday Night Live skit just recently kind of revealed the lie, right? Remember the character who plays Hillary Clinton says, "Vote for the Republican."
Right.
Right? And what we see right now happening is a different form of triangulation that has little to do with exploiting white resentment on behalf of containing and disciplining a black base.
Right.
It has more so to do with you should be afraid of Trump and you should feel safe with voting for me.
Right.
And so there's this, we've seen that commercial over and over, the Republican woman who's, right? So there's a sense in which the Democratic Party is in effect the moderate version of the Republican Party.
Right.
But they're both animated by the same economic ideology.
Right.
That has eviscerated not only the public domain, but has totally decimated workers, not only here, but around the globe, which has disproportionately impacted black communities, and particularly poor black communities,
right,
and particularly poor black women, poor black children, and the like.
Right, right. So I'm anticipating a question that I don't necessarily know will come from the audience, but I do think that because you're talking about the economic philosophy that undergirds everything today, right? So not just the move to privatization, but actually forms of governmentality that stage competition, right, and the casualization of labor. Everybody's in a precarious position now, even people who are formally educated, right? The constant hamster wheel that is required of all of us exists across the board, across the political spectrum, right? Or the electoral political spectrum. And then there's also neoconservatism, right? I mean, that's part of what disciplines us, I think, to the extent that we are into the Democratic Party is because, the war on women, right, being anti-choice, anti-LGBT rights, and the ideology of neoconservatism overlays for the conservatives in our society, overlays this economic philosophy, right? And so I'm wondering, sort of how do we think about how to engage politically in terms of that, right? You see what I'm saying? So how do we create how do we talk about a robust politics that's about the condition of the least of these, but also particular forms of domination and exclusion that are treated as identity formations as opposed to economic ones. Does that make sense?
Or simply as
economic, yeah.
Identity formations, as opposed to understanding its economic underpinning.
Yeah.
I mean, I think part of what we have to do is stand in the space of those particular constituencies and articulate the various ways in which they have experienced pain and suffering. In other words, from those particular vantage points, or those specific subject positions, we give voice to a politics that's predicated upon the notion of justice, right?
Right.
So it's not that you have to then move from the state of being, the vulnerability of the trans community. You have to deny the specificity of that identity, or the vulnerability of black women, or the vulnerability of poor children, and move to some broader universal category in order to talk across it. But there's a way in which you can move from the specificity of that suffering to a kind of politics that can call attention to this question, or this issue of justice, that standing in right relation, that gets us to the heart of an economic philosophy that's decimating us all, right? So part of the problem, and here you can, I really would love to hear you think about this, and we're not stalling, we're actually talking. It just happens to be the case that we're stalling.
Also.
It is one of the dangers of a certain kind of facile intersectionality, right? Where you can peel back these identities, right? And think about them, right, in these very
additive ways.
Yeah. And what happens in that moment, it becomes, very difficult to imagine a kind of radical politics that can get at the heart of your question.
Right.
Because we end up in these insular spaces, right, articulating our suffering. And that suffering is often predicated upon your inaccessibility to my experience of that suffering. Right? So we used to wear T-shirts back in the day at Morehouse. It's a black thing you wouldn't understand. Right? I used to love that T-shirt.
I had one too.
Yeah, I was wearing that T-shirt and reading my George James and my Sheikh Anta Diop and my Malcolm X and telling people you're psychologically enslaved.
It's so 80s.
It's so 80s, right? And so what happens is that when you have a version of an identity politics that leaves you into these insular spaces, when it comes time to build coalition, to kind of think about these structural realities that overdetermine the very ways in which you experience who you take yourself to be, you run up into all of these collisions. And we saw this, say, in Cleveland with the Black Lives Matter conference, right? Where people were saying, you're doing violence to me, and it became very difficult to get at some of these questions that you're talking about.
Yeah.
But maybe that's me and my.
Well.
Look who just walked up in here. Come on in here. Okay, everybody siss him when he comes. No, I'm just kidding. What's up, Mark? He.
Come on in.
I apologize, everyone. We've been driving since 3 o'clock. It's been awful traffic. I sincerely apologize. I've never been quite this late for anything.
We're all right. We've been holding it down.
We've been trying to hold it down.
So I actually do. I want to answer that question, and then
I just critiqued intersectionality.
Yes, critique.
Good.
Are you? Bring it closer. Okay, sorry. So one of the things that I think happens that is sort of hard to talk about the mechanics of, but that a neoliberal, any kind of order of the world that depends upon competition and marketing is actually quite voracious for novelty. And so there's a way in which sort of the additive identities, become something upon which you can trade, I'm this kind of person that you haven't seen before. And so trading upon one's identity in a competitive landscape can garner you individual benefits or wealth or attention, and attention is a commodity in the digital age, that doesn't necessarily accrue to the larger group. So I think part of what you're pointing to, Eddie, that I think is really important to think about is both the question of sort of the way we can get stuck in the possessiveness of identity, but also the way in which we can make ourselves stand in for communities in ways that are not politically honest. I think it's a real serious risk.
Hold up, say a little bit more about stand-in.
Well, I mean, I think, some of it is unavoidable, right? There's no question that to a certain extent in the roles that we have, we function as racial representatives, right? But the question is, and so we are often called to stand in and represent the larger group, and we get some benefits from that function. And I think the question that we have to ask ourselves then, though, is, what politics do we bring to that position, right? How do we have a critical relationship to that in such a way that we don't just trade upon it, but that we actually use that in order to connect to a larger politics, right? So I think sort of this question that you're raising about, like the kind of question that you're raising about intersectionality, I think points to the market formations of our identities generally nowadays, right? And the dangers of the trading upon who I am, as opposed to it being an occasion for a critical interrogation of the world in which we live, right? So the position I occupy affords me opportunities to witness certain things, right? But that's different than it becoming a commodity, right? And it's particularly insidious given the condition of large numbers of Black folks in the society, right? It's particularly dangerous. Right?
Value questions.
Oh, yeah. So the first question I asked was about, so I was talking about how we get a lot of heat for criticizing Obama and Clinton and being a green person over here, Green Party dude over here, right? And I was saying, part of what I was saying is that I think some of it is that people actually don't know the source of the political commitments, right? Some folks just don't like it, but I think also, the accusations, oh, you're jealous, or you are naive, or those sorts, come from a kind of a deep misunderstanding of what drives the positions that you take in the world. So I asked about sort of what are your core values, like what's the heart of your political commitments?
That's a good question. Thank you all for being here and for inviting me. I'm really honored. I think it's really this, for me, it's an obsession with a somewhat abstract idea of freedom.
Right.
But freedom is this thing that drives me, right? It's this abstract, in some ways very concrete, right? Conception of freedom. And so any political choice I make, I'm asking the question, does this expand on the possibilities of freedom? Does this allow a space for any kind of vision of freedom to be exercised? Does it foreclose on possibilities of freedom? And that becomes the thing. And at the same time that I'm trying to wrestle and unpack what freedom even means in the context of identity politics, in the context of very concrete material things as well. So, for example, to use the Hillary Clinton thing as an example, the question for me is always, is there a practical reason to vote for Hillary Clinton? Of course, there are very practical reasons why it may make sense, certainly as opposed to voting for, say, Donald Trump.
Right.
I don't even think that's in this room. We probably don't even have to hash that out. We don't have to have that discussion. Being on TV, sometimes you have to have you have to do that. But I also ask myself, what in a bigger picture, a bigger understanding of freedom, gets foreclosed upon if we rely on a candidate, one, on a neoliberal candidate, two, on someone whose ultimate vision is one of reform. When we're coming out of a tradition that relies on the radical imagination to animate all of our political action.
Right.
So for me, if I'm trying to imagine a world without prison as a prison abolitionist, then to me, even if I were to believe Hillary Clinton's position on prisons, the articulated one as opposed to her record in the 90s as an advocate and surrogate for Bill Clinton, I would still say this is not enough. Right? A world with warmer and fuzzier prisons is not
right.
Is not my vision of freedom.
Right.
A world where our wars of aggression are negotiated, more, perhaps slightly more humanely, but still a world where war becomes the primary instrument of foreign policy. Right. For me, is a dangerous world, and it's one that forecloses on the possibilities of freedom. And so, I think when I decide I'm going to not vote Democrat, I'm going to either blank out or strategically vote or vote green or vote whatever. It's, for me, a way of organizing people toward a different type of political formation, but it's also a way of challenging people to have a kind of thicker and more robust freedom dream.
Right.
And that, for me, might be more significant. But I have to weigh that against what we lose with, say, President Trump.
Right.
What do we lose? Because that's a very concrete material thing, and people will say, yeah, as, you know, faculty members and professors and TV commentators and stuff, you have the luxury of not of being abstract, because there are people whose lives will be hurt or worsened, at least, by a Trump presidency or whatever presidency. I tend to reject that argument on its face, just empirically, and say that I'm not sure that that's the case.
Right.
I'm not sure that the differences are as vast as we like to say that they are.
Right.
And we could go, that's a whole other conversation. But beyond that, I think the plight of the vulnerable, the condition of the vulnerable, will ultimately will never be rectified or never be nurtured properly until we have that robust freedom dream, until we can dream bigger than a political cycle.
Right.
Right. If we don't ever do that, then we always end up in this same space where people don't have access to quality work. People don't have access to living wages. People will continue to be droned in multiple countries around the world. We need something bigger. Right.
So, I mean, I want to challenge both of you, and I'm challenging you because I think that you all have answers to this. But, you know, there's some people who think, well, the voting is never really connected to a freedom dream in the American political system. It's simply sort of, it is never more than a gesture to stave off greater disaster. And so I'm wondering, is there actually another piece to it, right, that you're envisioning? Yes, it's an assertion of having a larger set of politics, but it's also an intervention, right, or, you know, an argument.
So, yeah, absolutely. I mean, part of what I want to argue and what I argue in Democracy in Black is that actually voting is the last thing you do.
Right.
Right. In a robust democratic society, right? That when you think about voting as being the proxy for democratic action, then you have a very truncated or anemic idea of what democracy is.
Right. Okay.
So what does it mean for a community to be organized around certain issues that ought to animate that community? What does it mean for a community to think about that everybody who lives in it should have a livable wage, that everyone should have access to health care, right? Should be able to have a roof over their heads, right? So, I mean, the ways in which you can parse that out. And what does it mean to be mobilized and organized around those issues, you know, 364 days out of a year,
right? As
opposed to on this election cycle, right? Or on November 8th, right? So part of what I use the vote, how I'm thinking about the vote strategically and tactically, or elections strategically and tactically, as these kind of telescoped moments to do organizing work, right? Because oftentimes, you know, I'm thinking about what happened to the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, right? When it changed its tactics or its aim and ambition to electing people, and how the election, whether you won or lost, resulted in demobilization.
Right.
As opposed to the election, right, constituting a different kind of moment, right? So for me, how might we think of this particular election cycle as a moment of organizing people, right, for a much broader politics, a much more radical politics, right? Such that we can talk about strategically voting. And so it's not about investing it with anything more than what it is, but using it as a moment to prepare ourselves for November 9th.
Right. As a Green Party supporter, I think I begin from that premise, right?
Right.
We're not sizing up the drapes in the White House. We're not organizing, you know, the band for the inauguration. We know Jill Stein's not going to be president in 3 weeks, right? So we're always thinking about how do we use this for organizing. And for me, in a more concrete way on the ground, it's for political education.
Okay.
So because the thing I say to people is I don't want to be in a position where I'm voting against something. I want us to have an affirmative vision, right? I want us to vote for something, right? Eddie and I were talking when he wrote Democracy in Black, and when he was talking about the blank out campaign, one of the things we talked about is I said, well, what about, and this is when he sent me the draft of the book, I said, what about instead of just leaving it blank, we write in something. Don't write in a person, write in mass incarceration. write in rape culture, write in something so that as we're organizing people, we have an affirmative vision of what we want. So when I go to people, and I'm not that invested in, I mean, I'm a member of the Green Party. I have been organizing for many years, but if there's another, I'm not tied to the party as much as I am this vision, you know? So, because we got our own stuff to do on racial justice with the Green Party. I mean, there's a lot of work that needs to be done there, a whole lot of work that needs to be done. That's the internal work I'm trying to do within the party. But when we go to folk and we start talking about trade or fair, people haven't even thought about what free trade is, because the way neoliberal logic works is that, first of all, the idea of free trade sounds good on its face, right? Until you understand the distinction between free and fair trade, particularly in the context of globalization. Voters are smart enough to understand this. We just don't bring it to them. So now we go to people's grandmoms talking about free trade, and we're having real conversations about that. Talking to people about prison abolition, you talk to the average black person in my community, I'm from North Philly, live in Germantown now. You talk to them about prison abolition, the first thing they say is, nah, bro, we need prisons, right?
Got lock some of these people.
You got lock some. I got this cousin, you know. If you met him, you would believe in prison, right? But then when you start to talk to people about what restorative models of justice could look like, what it means to shift the language from who did it and how do we punish them to who was harmed and how do we make them whole, people understand that, either from their church tradition or from their own experience of, yo, I done messed up and I want, you know. And so those conversations, the election becomes the occasion to organize people, and also to engage them in political education so they understand what's at stake in these in the debates. And then we're better equipped, I think, in 2016, 2020, but more importantly, to Eddie's point, tomorrow, November 9th, November 10th, to organize around local issues and to organize around campaigns that aren't about getting somebody elected to an office. And so for me, that's why I do it.
I want to pivot away from the election a little bit, but I want to start with something from the election to make that pivot, and I want to get to some discussion of both of your books. So one of the things that people have gotten very up in arms about is the absurd way that Donald Trump talks about black people's lives. Right? You walk out and you get shot walking down the street, and it's hell and all of this stuff, right? And I'm fascinated, and it's an absurd line of argument. What do you have to lose, right? But I'm fascinated by the immediate response, the knee-jerk response that we get, which is not all black people live like that. There are middle-class black people, there are fancy black people with this, right? And I'm fascinated by it because it's a really troubling political gesture, I think, right? Because we know that conditions are not ideal for black communities, right? I mean, that's so in many ways that's what undergirds both of your work, the category of nobody, right? The value gap, right? Some people matter more. Some people are off of the register of concern altogether in our society. So I was hoping you can talk about both why people do that, what is that, what is the need underneath the drive to tell, to contradict an account of the deep suffering that I think actually the majority of black people live in, right? But also, say something. I'd like to hear you guys say something about your take on the landscape we occupy now.
Well, I think the first part of your question, I think, speaks to the need for an affirmative vision, right? Of an affirmative political vision, because if not, then someone could conflate Eddie's argument, which is thoughtful and brilliant and progressive, with Donald Trump's argument, right? Because if you're not thinking through this quickly or deeply, you'd say, okay, well, Eddie says Democrats ain't doing nothing for you anyway. Yeah. And Donald Trump is saying Democrats ain't doing nothing for you anyway. We're both saying they ain't doing nothing for you anyway. What do you have to lose?
Right.
Because we're in a posture where we're voting against something.
Right.
If we have an affirmative vision of what we want schools to look like this. We want our communities to look like this. We want prisons to not exist. We want policing to, if we want it to exist, and I don't, but if we want it to exist, we want it to look a very particular way. Then suddenly Donald Trump's argument collapses, right? Because he has no worldview. He has no political view. And I'm not just about Trump, just in general. So when he speaks, we'd say, okay, well, it's not enough to say Democrats have done you poorly, so just elect a fascist, right? It's saying, okay, what do we want out of a candidate? What's our vision? And I think that's why I think it's very easy for Donald Trump's argument to be persuasive to people. One, because Democrats have failed us, and two, because we haven't organized around a set of core values and principles enough in the public sphere about what we want. Of course, everyone has values and ideas, but I'm not sure that we've articulated them in our political formation enough. I think.
But What I really am interested in is the immediate gesture, the knee-jerk response, right, and what that does.
I think there's a bigger conversation about the poor, the vulnerable, the nobodies, as it were, that don't exist in the public sphere, and suddenly middle class values, bourgeois ideals, and culture begins to overdetermine the political discourse.
Right.
So what happens is, which is why you can have a debate between Democrats and Republicans, and you watch it, and the same thing happened at the State of the Union, everywhere else. The word poor literally doesn't get said.
Right.
Poor people don't get identified. It's all about rescuing the middle class, saving the middle class, healing the middle class, not being too burdensome on the rich. And so poor people, or the vulnerable in many ways, don't get entered into the conversation
at all. Right.
And so if there's a bourgeois vision, political vision anchoring this whole thing, then when Donald Trump says you get shot walking down the street no matter where you are, because the discourse is controlled by middle class values, it's like, well, we don't get shot. I was where did bougie people go in Massachusetts in the summer?
Martha's.
I'm sorry. Forgive me, people. I just couldn't remember.
That was a little dig right there.
No. Believe me, I'm trying to I'm trying to go in August. I just couldn't remember the name. I'm fighting a cold. I want to be there in August.
You believe that?
Well, I swear I wasn't being shady, but I see how it could be read that way. I'm not that clever, I promise. But then people, of course, scramble to show that we are human too, that we don't get shot all the time.
That we're human. Right. That's what that is.
But the problem is the index of humanity becomes that. It becomes a market value. It becomes a bourgeois aspiration. Right. As opposed to saying, I don't get shot everywhere because all black people aren't animals. Right. Because we have community, because we have love, because we have ethics of care. Because all of these space directions we could go in. Yeah. And so we're just trying to affirm our humanity, but again, in this way that gets shaped by these particular values. Yeah. That's dangerous.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating question, and I agree with everything Marc just laid out. I think there are two things that are going on that has nothing to do with what's happening. Right? So on the one hand, when Donald Trump says what he says about black people, he's not talking to black people. He's talking to white people. Right. He's activating certain kinds of stereotypes, certain kinds of generalizations about black life in order to mobilize these constituencies for X, Y, and Z. And typically X is always a call for law and order. It's the first thing. Even in the irony of the New Deal for black America, there was an irony yesterday, right? Donald Trump delivered a talk where he declared a New Deal for black America, and DeRay McKesson wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post where he said that Hillary Clinton's $125 billion investment will amounted to the New Deal. We got two people from two very different spaces, spaces invoking the language of New Deal in reference to black people.
Coincidentally, of course.
Yeah, coincidentally, right. And so in that moment, the first thing I'm suggesting is that he's not really talking about or to black people in that moment. So it's really about activating and mobilizing a particular constituency, telling them it's okay to vote for me, right? I'm going to call for law and order. We're going to talk about school vouchers, and then we're going to talk about, basically Republican market-driven ways to increase employment among these people who, without employment, are totally a total threat to the social fabric of our society, who aren't beholden to social norms and the like. So you get that three-component thing. And then the irony of the second response is that, that's not me, isn't really about black folk at all. It's about, it is about black folk, but it reveals the bankruptcy of black liberalism. Because black liberalism has, in interesting sorts of ways, been silent around the black poor.
Right. There we go.
Right. Part of its strategy has always been a kind of bourgeois discourse of uplift, right? Where we are critical of Ronald Reagan's economic philosophy of trickle down, but we have a racial trickle down model of activism, you see? And so there's this moment where you have, on the one hand, Trump activating stereotypes and generalizations about black life in the name of talking about black people, and particularly poor and vulnerable. And then you have people defending poor and vulnerable who aren't really defending the poor and vulnerable, but really positing a particular kind of politics that's bankrupt, that has no real interest in the black poor outside of a kind of charitable, philanthropic enterprise, right? As they try to, in some ways, defend the poor in order to justify a respectable middle.
Right.
Right, because as long as the black poor are seen in this way,
right,
the middle and the upper middle can't be viewed in a particular sort of way, and that goes all the way back to the 19th century, actually. Right. So it's this really fascinating.
More about that. And can you unpack that? Because I think that's
right. I think there's always been a dimension and we know respectability discourse from your work, Imani, is much more complicated than how people are represented in our contemporary moment. But there is this kind of sense, right, where the black bourgeoisie has always tried to constitute itself over and against, in interesting sorts of ways, at least representationally, right, a degraded lower.
Right.
So one way in which we can acquire respectability is by engaging in uplift all of these uncouth, uncivilized Southerners who laugh too loud and who aren't taking baths enough, who are coming up from the South. Those laughing barrels, stick your head in there, don't laugh out loud, these sorts of things, right, that you read about in Ralph Ellison's Shadow and Act, right? There's this way in which disciplining a black lower has everything to do with solidifying the place of a black middle class in the imagination of the nation.
And I want to add something to that, which is also, I think, a bit of a provocation, but I think is true. At the same time, in the post-civil rights context, we have a landscape in which all of the sort of visions of racial justice they're not redistributive. They are actually sort of according a narrow scope, a narrow set of opportunities, right? A narrow set of individuals who have access. So there's both the setting oneself over and against, right, the poor, but it's also that we receive all of the benefits of whatever minor they are, that the nation seeks to distribute in response to the depth of inequality, which the black poor suffer most dramatically. You see what I'm saying? So those who benefit from affirmative action or access to it disproportionately are elites, right? But the argument in behalf of those things are the kind of inequality that the black poor suffer.
Right, absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
So
let me ask Marc a question. So talk a little bit about this concept of nobodiness that animates the text, and how each chapter is illustrative of that concept, and I mean concrete examples. Talk a little bit about this concept of nobody.
Yeah, and I have to actually say, Eddie read a draft of the book and actually helped me think through how to thread that through, which is the preface is because of you and you telling me to. No, I'm serious. I mean, that's what we do. We read each other's stuff and give ideas. I mean, I'm grateful. I'm grateful. But you forced me to think through this a bit more in a very concrete way. This question of nobodiness, and for me, it was about a politics of disposability. And there is a way in which certain people have been erased from the social contract. There are people who have, through our sort of public policy, our institutional arrangements, the power dynamics of our nation, have been seen as unworthy of the spoils of democratic citizenship. You're just not entitled to this same stuff. There are people who have been erased from public view. There are people whose social misery is less, it incurs a different type of response than others, right? Some folk, we could see this in a very concrete way even with how we address drug addiction, right? We frame not just the crack powder difference, right? But even the way within our public discourse, how we think about the crackhead versus the cocaine addict, right? Cocaine addicts make bad choices. Crackheads are bad people. Where do you put bad people? Jail, right? And so we have this whole way that we frame certain people. So part of it is at the interpersonal level, but a deeper issue, and where the book goes really, is that this is a structural issue, that we can't reduce this to the interpersonal, because too often that's what we do. That's a simple answer. Right? You got bad cops that shoot people innocently, and if we could just get rid of these bad cops, we'd have a different type of circumstance. But I'm saying there's a deeper question of whose lives are worth saving, whose lives are worth protecting, whose lives are worth investing in, whose children are permitted to have a childhood, right? So when Tamir Rice is standing there with a 14, with a toy gun at 12 years old, and there's a few things happening, right? There's the psychological dimensions of this, and Imani gets into this, obviously, with her book and this whole idea of post-intentional racism, right? We have to look at the cultural, the psychological, the structural issues around racism, and not just the interpersonal. So when Tamir Rice is standing there at Cleveland, the cop pulls up and immediately begins shooting. There's multiple levels to this, right? The easy answer is there's just a cop who's racist, or a cop who's impulsive, or a cop who's scared. But there's so many different levels to this. Someone calls in and says, there's a 20-year-old boy standing there. Not a 12-year-old, but a 20-year-old. Studies show, and Philip Atiba-Goff did a really interesting and important study that talks about the way in which black boys get read by law enforcement. They're seen as older and guiltier than their white counterparts. So there's a way in which structurally we see these people as bad people. We see children as bad people. From a developmental perspective, we're looking at black boys and girls to a large extent, not as children, but as really short adults, right? We see them as having the mannerisms, the aggression, and the need to kind of contain as we would an adult. And so they pull up and they immediately begin shooting. Tamir Rice is playing with a toy gun, right? Children have, and I'm not advocating toy guns, but children have imagination. Part of childhood is having imagination. It's play. It's having a certain level of freedom. It's a freedom that we afford white children. It's a freedom that's not afforded to black children. All these are part of a politics of disposability, right? Their childhood, their lives, their bodies, all of this, their imaginations, all of this matters. So by the time we get to the point that he's shooting him, a whole bunch of stuff has already happened. By the time Mike Brown gets shot, a bunch of stuff has already happened. By the time Sandra Bland is found in her cell, a lot of stuff has already happened. And this stuff that's happening is to me far more important in our conversation about nobodiness than the shooting itself, right? So in the first chapter, and I'm not going to go through everything, but in the first chapter, when we talk about Mike Brown, we're talking about not just Mike Brown as a person, we're talking about the flight of jobs, right? Capital flight. We're talking about Emerson Electric going off to the Far East. We're talking about public housing collapsing. We're talking about all these structures that are supposed to support and invest in people that don't, right? Once white folk left, the entire structure of St. Louis changes, the entire structure of Missouri changed, because these black folks, their lives are disposable. They don't need access to quality housing. They don't need access to public schools. Give them the Normandy School District. And so all of these things become a way that people get framed. And as I go through the book, I'm trying to show that these different instances of violence, or even state violence, are not reducible to the interpersonal, but they're also not reducible to the physical. So, when we talk about broken windows policing, that's a particular understanding of how to engage a community as occupying force rather than people who are invested in the community. Structure, when we talk about public defender's office, the very collapse of the public sphere itself, our failure to believe in the private interest more than the public good is another form of disposability. When I talk about the cage chapter, I'm talking about prison being the way that we resolve our social contradictions, right? Because people are disposable, if people are in mental institutions, we just closed the mental institutions in the late 70s, early 80s, put people on the street. But we don't want people on the street, because who wants to see people on the street? So we make it illegal to be on the street. So now we put people in jail for being on the street. So we have this kind of transcarceration where you go from being in a mental facility to being in a prison. We've essentially criminalized mental illness. We've criminalized homelessness. We've criminalized poverty. And we do it because we don't want to see it. We do it because it's easier to do that than to invest in drug treatment, to invest in other models of justice. That's the nobodiness. That's the disposability. That's the erasure. And it plays out to the intersectional point, finally, not just for black folk, and certainly not just for black men, but in all these categories of so-called difference, we see many of them result in a certain kind of erasure from the social contract, a certain kind of disposability. And I argue at the beginning of the book that all of this happens against the backdrop of a state that defends class at all costs, so that we don't reduce this to identity politics and we don't reduce class to an identity category, but we're saying that in the context of a class-defending state, all of these things happen more in more intense fashion, in more acute fashion, and really in ways that are much more less easily retractable.
And there's a dimension of that, right, that is, in addition to the fact that we don't want to see people, there's a lot of money made off of locking people up, right?
Right.
And the wealth is generating, right?
And that's the problem. What Gil Scott-Heron said, everybody love peace. The problem is you can't make no money off of it, right? So all these contradictions, all these issues are generate capital for everybody but the vulnerable. Whether it's privatization of mass incarceration facilities, whether it's the public defender's office. Now we have contract attorneys who are taking these vast numbers of cases against the interests of the people who are defendants, But it makes money for folk. It's economically efficient for the public, for these public, so-called public offices, and it's economically lucrative for the people who are now taking this privatized money. And we see this idea of privatization, this idea of all these sort of moves, whether it's notions of efficiency, whether it's notions of austerity, notions of privatization, all this stuff generates money for the already wealthy and for the powerful at the expense of the powerless and the relatively powerless. And that's, again, a part of this nobodiness, this economic thrust behind it all.
Hard to break through that when you have people like, I mean, think about everybody was celebrating President Obama no longer contracting with private companies for private prisons, right?
Right.
But at the same time, renewing a 10-year contract for private prisons around immigration.
Right.
Right. So selling you a 6 for a 9, as we might say, right? In some ways.
So, I mean, related to that, the question, I think we should talk, and I want to open it up for the questions and discussion soon, but we should talk a little bit about the movement. That the movement for Black Lives, which has multiple versions and iterations and dimensions and lots of different constituencies and various politics, but it is a response to a very particular form of state violence in the form of police shooting it's generating. And I'm interested in your thoughts about where it is, where it ought to go versus where it's going, sort of potentially. I mean, what is the usefulness and also the potential dangers associated with that particular focus? I mean, you described there's so many things that happen before that moment, right?
You know, I end the book, Nobody, with this chapter, Somebody, as an attempt, one, to just not end on this dark note, right? I wanted to end on with a sense of hope and possibility that despite everything that's happened, that we can be somewhere different. I think when Mike Brown dies in 2014, I think it ushered in, I don't know, I think that was a turning point. And I think every generation has these moments, whether it's Emmett Till, there's these moments where we say enough and where young people organize and we see action on the ground. And I'm actually excited and energized by what I've seen over the last 2 years in general. I was excited to see a different model of leadership. I was excited to see it not be largely housed inside of a church. I was excited to see an interest in at least talking about LGBT issues at the same time, right? That we're not just going to talk about men, but we're going to talk about both trans and cis folk. We're going to talk about gay, lesbian, bisexual folk. It mattered to me, and that also that there was an internationalization of at least our vision and our action, right? That I was really excited by, and despite what many people have said, there were some concrete demands. There long before the policy statement came out, because that was the narrative, right? Y'all keep protesting, but y'all don't know what y'all want, and now the people are listening, y'all ain't got nothing to say. That was kind of the dismissive response, and I found that that wasn't the case. What concerns me about the movement right now, and every movement, I'm not romantic about movements. I think movements have infighting, movements have tensions. Ain't been a moment in history where that hasn't happened. But I worry about two things. I worry about the co-optation, the constant co-optation of the movement, and who gets framed as the leader of a leaderless movement. I worry. It's seductive. Power is seductive, and I worry that folk who have been positioned as leaders, one, don't represent the interests of the movement, but two, are being co-opted in ways that actually undermine the movement. I'm watching the movement become more and more parochial. The kind of energy we had when we went from Ferguson to Palestine in 2015, I'm concerned that we're becoming more and more narrowly focused on elections and more narrowly focused on domestic stuff, when I think there was a possibility of really doing some really interesting international work that was there 2 years ago that's less there now. And I do wonder, while I think we have concrete political demands, many of which I think are attainable, I want to know what the goal is. What's the end of this, right? So if we're fighting for body cameras, are we actually fighting to disarm police? You can't have both, right? Or maybe you can. I mean, some would argue you can. I would argue you can't. I'm wondering whether we're still adopting a radical political vision, or whether we've moved into a more reform posture. That worries me a little bit in terms of some of the concrete moves we've made. Yeah.
I mean, I really would, Professor Taylor would have offered a really wonderful, I hope she's okay.
Yes.
Because this is completely unusual. She would have offered, I think, a really great answer to this question. I think one of the first things we have to do is to think of Black Lives Matter as a kind of category that works a lot like Black Power. And what I mean by that is that a lot of different political iterations fall under the label,
Yes.
that conflict, that collide. Although what happens is that Black Power kind of singles out a sensibility, a tendency that allows you to group them together. But Black Power contains folk ranging from the Nation of Islam, right, to folks who are organized, who are Pan-African revolutionaries, right? Very, very wide range of politics. And so what we're seeing, I think, in an interesting way is the kind of beginnings of ideological differentiation within that movement. So we're beginning to see people move from a kind of joint protest to where we're beginning to see how that protest evidences itself in actual politics. So folks are kind of embracing, becoming more radical, embracing a radical agenda. So when you look at the policy platform of the Movement for Black Lives and you compare that to Campaign Zero, you begin to see that you have centrist liberals over and against people who are reaching for a much more materialist understanding of the conditions of black folks. So we're beginning to see ideological differentiation, which means we're going to see contestation, right? That's going to go beyond just simply personality, right? It's going to go beyond simply personality. So that's the first thing. The second thing I would say is that it's not only co-optation and absorption, it's the pace of it. That's really fascinating. You know, in the 90s and the 2000s, many cultural critics and postmodern theorists, and we put that in inverted commas because I'm not quite sure I know what that means, right? We're talking about the pace, the change in time, right? And how things moved, right? And they were thinking about whether it was image, whether it was the pace of commodity circulation. Things happened more quickly. And I was talking with Professor Perry on the way over here. You know, when you think about the 60s and the 70s, right, there are people who were involved in the struggle who ended up in government, who ended up, right, giving voice to a politics that wasn't consistent with the actions that they demonstrated in Mobile or in Tuscaloosa or in Atlanta, right? But it took a while, right? Ferguson is 2014. We already got people running for mayor, right? I mean, and DeRay is in my book, DeRay and Brittany and Netta, they're all important figures, examples of a kind of politics that I'm calling for, right? But I had no idea of the pace or character, right? I had no idea of the pace, right? So one of the things, for example, DeRay and Brittany meet with Hillary Clinton 2 days ago. And then immediately after that meeting, there is a piece published in Elle magazine where Brittany's interviewing with Melissa Harris Perry. And then 2 days later, DeRay publishes his piece in the Washington Post. Now, those of us who move in these circles know that that is completely, right, manufactured. That is so deliberately planned and rolled out, right? And so that's how it happens. It just doesn't happen by just simply announcing that you're going to vote for Clinton, that you're going to get space. You could be tight with Wes Lowery, but that's not just going to happen, right? So what we're seeing in that moment is a kind of politics, right? That's being evidenced, and we have to be mindful of it. So the pace. And then the third point that I want to make is that alongside Black Lives Matter, right, alongside its attempts to the ideological differentiation in the pace of co-optation and absorption, there are other movements that are happening, right? So when we think about Forward Together with Reverend Barber in North Carolina, right, it's not Black Lives Matter, it's not unchurched, right? It's actually a real interesting response, a kind of attempt to recapture a prophetic, religious, Black prophetic tradition. And it's articulating a politics that cuts across the various identities that we're talking about. And it's at ground zero, because that's where the Koch brothers began right, their efforts right in North Carolina. So what's happening with the Forward Together movement? What's happening with Moral Mondays? How are we thinking about the relationship between organizers and Fight for 15? So there are all of these other dynamic spaces where activism is happening, right, alongside BLM, right, that we need to keep track of. And I think that's important. And I think it's really important for an idea of politics that goes beyond, right, election cycles, goes beyond the duopoly or the two-party system. It goes beyond the current frame of what constitutes legitimate forms of political dissent in this moment.
Yeah. I am really about to open it up for questions, but I also wonder, I like the way that you all talk about either, the language of networks, the language of vision, because one of the difficulties of this moment, though, is even when we engage in critique of figures who come to the fore, is that it's also it's really hard to distinguish between critique, which is about a competitive desire for attention. Your attention is focused in the wrong direction. You need to look here instead of there. That's not the real person. This is the right. Versus an actual, real, engaged discussion about what our politics are going to be. Right.
Yeah.
I think that so. It becomes difficult even to engage in the practice of being critical because you just get wrapped up, right? Scooped up in that stuff. Questions, comments?
Hi. When we talk about politics, do we have a mic? Oh, Amina's coming. We got ahead of ourselves.
Arturo Lewis, William Patterson University.
Hi.
Demetrius Lewis, your former student, says hello. Mm-hmm. When we talk about politics, we're often speaking about legislators, legislation, the implementation of this. How does culture regionally and nationwide impact legislation? We're more than 50 years removed from the Civil Rights Act, more than 150 years removed from the Civil War. So how do we address the way we think, the way we live, as a way of influencing the legislation?
So, in Democracy in Black, I want to make an ethical argument, right? Well, let me say it differently. I make a kind of philosophical argument underneath all the stuff that you read, and part of what I'm trying to suggest is that who we take ourselves to be matters, right? That democracies require particular kinds of dispositions to work. And the value gap distorts and deforms who we take ourselves to be. It limits our understanding of mutuality. It distorts our understanding of justice, right? It interrupts and blocks empathy, right? In other words, the value gap, right, undermines expressions of democratic virtue. And so how then do we talk about becoming the kinds of persons that democracies require? And it involves, and here I'm relying on Professor Perry's work in terms of her understanding of racial inequality as a kind of cultural practice and what needs to happen, right, if we're going to fundamentally change and transform our circumstances. And that goes beyond just simply kind of working on the internal self, right? It goes beyond, that's why I don't use the language of implicit bias in the book. I use the language of habits, because habits are plastic. And those of you who've read your Aristotle and your Dewey, you know that habits are, the interpenetration of habit is the definition of character. Right? So we can change habits by, in effect, changing the institutional spaces that we occupy. So how do we affect this kind of cultural solution that leads to the deformation and distortion of who we take ourselves to be? We have to do politics in a very substantive and significant, and I want to suggest radical way. But it's all bound up with, and so here I'm kind of taking your question and pulling it in a different direction. It's all bound up with who do we take ourselves to be? And that's a different kind of question than whether or not America is on its way to being a more perfect union, whether or not we're living up to our ideals. Whenever you find yourself in that frame, you're caught. The politics have immediately been truncated to an argument about America as such, as opposed to about who we take ourselves to be.
How do we? So, I agree. I'm thinking through this though, and I'm wondering the very conception of self that we have is also kind of truncated, right? Like as we're thinking, who can we be? The possibilities for that are also foreclosed on, right? And maybe even our conception of democracy. How do we break out of that? That's the part I always wrestle with. How do we break out of that as a practical matter?
Oh,
that's for both of you. I'm just asking.
Oh. I don't. It's interesting. We had a very similar question the last time the three of us were in conversation.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting because I think all of us have been. It's clear that we've been thinking about this question because there's a way in which, right, the context in which we live is one of capture, right, and we cannot, and we have to have the kind of. I mean, both of you talked about a kind of analysis that draws out from the moment, that moves out beyond the self, that understands relations of power, that understands those structures that we live within, right? And yet, right, and I think this goes back to that word that we've already had invoked is, and yet we have to embrace the political imagination, right? And it does begin with, I think at the very core, acts of refusal, right? Even before we get to the point of imagining different terms of right relation, to say refusal, right, of being defined by the terms of the society in which we live at present, is a starting. I think is a critical starting point.
Just to invoke the late Stuart Hall, in terms of conjunctural moments,
right,
conjunctural moments of crisis and possibility. And to put that into conversation with the late Sheldon Wolin, thinking about democracy not so much in terms of procedures, not so much in terms of structures of governance, but to think about democracy as a kind of standing in the breach. Right? And what I mean by that is that he wants to understand democracy as fugitive, that it's not a governing ideology, right? But it's a standing in opposition. Right, and so you have these kind of conjunctural moments where the contradictions of a form of life are in full view, that constitute an opening, and you have to stand in the breach. And as you stand in the breach, the possibility of imagining oneself on different terms, right, occurs. So you can imagine what happens. You have a conjunctural moment in the context of the South, and you have sharecroppers who have understood themselves under particular sorts of conditions, right, given the materiality of their lives. And then that conjunctural moment, there's an opening and they stand in the breach, and there's a moment to reimagine the self, to kind of think of oneself in different terms. Now, there's always going to be a rearguard action because it's fugitive.
Right.
It's going to close, right? This is the kind of the darkness of the vision. It's going to close. But what does it mean to understand moments of crisis as moments of possibility? And what does it mean to think about a democratic stance as, in effect, and here I'm echoing the tradition out of which I come, standing in the breach? And that becomes the condition for the possibility of imagining oneself anew.
And by implication, it requires other people. It depends.
Right.
It depends upon community,
Absolutely.
right? It's not an individual exercise. Next question.
Absolutely. Yes. Trust. Y'all all right?
Yeah. Oh, sorry, my foot hurts, so I'm gonna say it sitting. So I heard you guys talk a little bit about like neoliberalism and also about like radicality. So like moving away from doing what's already been done. And I wonder, just like practical ways that you guys think. So I'm going to bring it like sort of like within the community. So like, how do you think that Black people who exist at an intersection, like you mentioned the poor, or like queer Black people, or like Black people of different intersections that are marginal within the Black community, can have like truly radical positions, which at times make them contrary to the actual community in which they exist, the Black community as a whole. So like, how does that work in terms of like politics and like practical ways you can live that out, I guess?
For me, it's about, I'll speak just first just from an organizing perspective. I think it's really important for our sort of ideologies and our philosophies to be intersectional, but also our actual organizing practices, right? Because as they organize, I think it challenges people who are on the margins within the community or rather people who are not on the margins within the community, to wrestle with what it means to be on the margins within the community. I'll give you a concrete example. We were organizing. I've been organizing against prisons for many years, and I came out of the kind of critical resistance tradition, and we thought a lot about what it meant to abolish prisons, and we were often working with folk whose almost exclusive commitment was anti-prison work and sometimes anti-poverty work, etc. But then in 2011 or 2012, C.C. McDonald was arrested, and she was charged, and she was convicted in Minnesota of a Black trans woman. She defended herself against a transphobic attack. The person died. She was found guilty of, I believe, it may have been manslaughter. But either way, she was charged, she was convicted, and she was sentenced to, I think, 5 to 7 years in a men's prison facility. And so the trans community began to organize and protest, and the anti-prison movement began to organize and protest. And as we began to organize and think and write, and to be quite honest, I hadn't done any work on trans activism or trans work. I hadn't really thought about the issue. It wasn't that I didn't care, I just hadn't thought about it deeply before. And as we began to work and organize, we began to ask different questions within the context of being anti-prison. We started to ask questions about what it meant for penal institutions and also the state to define gender. We just hadn't thought about that before. It wasn't in our agenda. We didn't understand. We understood prisons to be criminogenic. We understood that they, reproduce criminality, they expanded criminality. We understood them to be spaces of trauma, but we didn't necessarily think about. We hadn't even thought about it, the idea of torture, the idea of cruel and unusual punishment, the idea of subjecting someone who's a woman to a sentence in a men's prison when all the data suggests that 85, sometimes 88% of trans people experience some sort of sexual assault, sexual violence in prison, in men's prison. So to sentence someone to that is essentially sentencing them to a form of torture as a practical matter. So by organizing it and intersecting and connecting our movements, not just our conversations, because if you would ask anybody in the anti-prison movement if they were intersectional in their analysis of the world, or if they believed in trans rights or LGBT rights, they would say sure. But because we had organized and connected, there were issues that came up, there were challenges that came up to how we organized even, that we were forced to wrestle with in a different way. We didn't realize how cis-centered our organizing was, our leadership models were, our goals for prisons, etc. And so in organizing differently, I think we were able to wrestle with those things differently. Ultimately, I do think it's a question of political education. But I think as we organize, that political education can happen in real time. Outside of that, though, I think we simply literally have to do political education. And I think as someone who's been an activist for a long time, it's something we don't do enough of. We often organize for an issue. We often organize or respond to an issue. We march, we fight, we sit, and we do whatever we do. But I'm not sure the deeper philosophical questions get raised, the deeper intellectual questions get raised, which is why, and I'm not trying to do this generational thing, but when we were doing activism 20 years ago, I'm going to do it a little bit, they were accompanied by reading groups. We have political, and I'm not saying no one does that now, but many of the activists I see, particularly in the Twitter context, many haven't read Du Bois. They haven't read Stewart. They're not familiar with the political backdrop to the stuff they're wrestling with. I'm sure every generation says this. So I don't want to act like this generation has gotten this thing completely wrong. But what I'm finding is many people, even positioned as leaders, have read very little about these things. And so when it comes time to wrestle with these contradictions and wrestle with those folk on the margin and think through these ideas in a different and dynamic way, we only have 140 characters worth of information. And that creates problems, I think, in getting to the thing you're talking about.
Yeah, I also think there's I think that's absolutely right. And there's something about what it means to be radical has to do with where your attention lies. And I think, a commitment to an interrogation of the layers of domination that we live under, such that, we started this conversation talking about the least of these, right? So if we begin the conversation with sex workers, right, with the homeless, with trans women of color, and we actually read the layers of domination from that position, I think we actually get to something much more rigorous in terms of our analysis, right? And part of this, and I'm harping on this point because I really do think it's a danger. Part of the reason we don't tend to do that is that we operate with racial politics often with the logic of a racial representative. And the racial representative almost always is in some fashion a person with relatively far more opportunity or access than the others, right? And so it distorts our politics. Right? So I would say, you raised a question about how does one function in a radical position vis-a-vis a larger community against which you may receive a lot of hostility. I mean, I think there's an obligation upon all of us to orient our politics around that kind of vision if we're actually talking about justice work, right? If we're not just talking about things getting a little bit easier for me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Questions?
Hi.
Hi.
I'm Toby, and I have two questions. One is about what you said about prison abolition. So you said something about how you can't get rid of the problem by just making nicer prisons. And so I understand that to an extent, and I understand the need to abolish. I'd like to say that I think I understand the need to abolish prisons, but then I also wonder about the inmates in prison right now who can very much benefit from better health care, help with like mental, physical, sexual abuse, kind of like getting rid of solitary confinement. And so I wonder like how those two conversations exist in the same space, and like how prison abolitionists like include that when they're talking about at the risk of like getting stuck in that space. That's
a great question, and it's the central tension that we've wrestled with for the last 20 years in terms that I've been involved, with this question. Some take more extreme positions than others. There are folk, even within critical resistance, there were debates where folk were like, no, we don't even want like counselors, mental health counselors, right? We don't. There are folk who were saying we don't want anything. We don't want prison libraries. We don't want, because it was like, we want to tear this thing down. There's an ethical question that gets raised around what do you do when these are real people, right? These aren't abstract ideas. These aren't abstract people. These are physical people who need health care or whatever. And I struggle with that, to be honest. So I don't have a perfect answer for you. My answer, though, is at each turn, I ask the question, does this reinforce the legitimacy of the prison? And is it possible to hold on to this particular action while holding on to an abolitionist vision? Sometimes the answer is yes, sometimes the answer is no. For example, I believe that condom distribution inside of a prison is not a reformist gesture. It's a public health gesture. It's a safety gesture. When the Prison Litigation Reform Act came out in 1996, it was definitely a Clinton era thing. It was one of those bills that didn't get as much attention as the crime bill, but was just as dangerous. Where essentially they argued that prisoners couldn't. They basically closed the courthouse doors to prisoners to make it very difficult for them to fight their own cases, to litigate their own cases. And the key example was these prisoners want a salad bar. That was like the classic case, right? The prisoners want a salad bar. And it became like the news media picked it up and took it up and all this stuff. What they were actually asking for was something. They were saying that there were no healthy food options. And people were dying from a lack of healthy food options. And what they said as a solution was perhaps salad bar. They were really just saying, we want no more asbestos. We want no more roaches in the food, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We're finding rat pellets in the food. Like, that's what they were actually fighting for. That's what the case was about. They weren't going to court for the salad, right? That said, a case like that, to me, fighting for one's right to have healthy food options is not a reformist gesture. And so again, I wouldn't fight that. I do have some struggle with the, Obama's he's doing a pilot program, with the FAFSA thing, is it? Yeah, not FAFSA, Pell grants. I do struggle with that, and that's something that I would probably fight against. And I wouldn't actively say stop people from getting Pell Grants, but that would not be something that I would side with, because I think that, again, reinforces a very particular idea around prison. For me, prison abolition is about excarceration and decarceration, right? It's about getting folk out of jails, and it's about sort of no longer using prison as the kind of resolution to the problem, and no longer creating laws that allow people to be incarcerated for things that they probably shouldn't be for. So when Obama announces last month that bail, that on the federal system, that bail is something that we're going to look into and hopefully eliminate because it doesn't really work. The bail system doesn't work. All it's doing is really serving as a punishment for the poor. To me, that's not a reform move. That's actually moving toward abolition, because at the same time that it's technically a reform, but it's also getting people out of prison. So it fits the criterion of decarceration, because by doing this, we're taking fewer people, we're putting fewer people in jail, and we're also acquainting the public with the idea that people don't have to be in jail because they don't have enough money to pay the bail. So it also becomes a way of shaping public opinion around the prison, right? Because people say, we do it all the time, right? That cop shot our kid, he should have a $5 million bail. We do it too, right? We start to think of bail as a punishment, and jail as a way of resolving a moral issue. I'm saying we don't have to do that. So again, I know this isn't a perfect answer. I struggle with it. I wrestle with it. And in the movement, there are so many internal debates about prison counseling, drug counseling, rape counseling, condoms, libraries. And many of us resolve it by saying, does this increase our chances? There's no perfect solution to this. But for me, in general, things that get people out, I'm inclined to go with. And I'm sorry I don't have a better answer for you, but it's a messy process.
We can take 3 more questions, because you guys got to buy the book.
Oh, I enjoy this conversation more than about selling y'all books, man.
Thank you for being here. My name is William Pugh. I'm a freshman here this year. My question is about the Black church. This semester I'm taking a course in this department called African American Religious History. And during precept, the question kind of came up from the professor related to the Black Lives Matter movement today, and kind of looking back at the civil rights movement in the 60s. I mean, when we think of the civil rights movement, one of the first images that pops up in your head would be like Dr. King, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the Black church, and how influential that was in the movement. And even today, I mean, more contemporary activists, you think Reverend Jesse Jackson or Reverend Sharpton, thank you. So how do you feel the Black Lives Matter movement has or hasn't incorporated the Black church, and do you feel that that's something that's beneficial, or do you think that's like an inhibition to the movement?
I think one of the amazing things about, I think there's an interesting way in which we're narrating Black Lives Matter as unchurched, right? And I think there's something at stake in that we have to interrogate. When I went to Ferguson, the first place I landed was a synagogue where Metropolitan United were organizing religious communities in Ferguson to talk about whether or not they were going to be sanctuary or safe spaces, thinking about where they were going to be, how they were going to roll, what role they were going to play. I met Reverend Renita Lampkin. I met Reverend Tracy Blackman in those spaces, right? And then there was Reverend Sekou, who organized October. What was it called? Ferguson October.
October, yeah.
Where you had clergy and others come down to Ferguson, and many, like Cornel West and Jim Wallace and others, were arrested. The interesting thing about it is that there are tensions, because the following year, Millennial Activists United, Brittany and Alexis and others were actually protesting outside of churches on Easter Sunday, saying, what role will you play in this movement? So there was a critique. And then, of course, that critique has everything to do with some churches, and there's a conservative theology with regards to the LGBTQ leadership of Black Lives Matter. So there is this kind of interesting kind of tension, but church, African American religion is present. Folk forget that Bree Newsom was citing Psalm as she was coming down the flagpole, right? Movements generally, not just simply Black Lives Matter movement, but Reverend Barber. Reverend Barber is one of the more important voices out there. so I think what we're asking ourselves the question, because there's always this question, this declension narrative, right, which, bless you, which is predicated upon a story that isn't true, right, that black churches in the 1960s were all prophetic. Right? We know that's a lie, right? And there were a small number of churches that opened their doors. There were a small number of preachers and pastors who actually were on the front lines doing the work. Not everyone was Reverend Shuttlesworth, right? Not everyone was Reverend Shuttlesworth. And so part of what I'm interested in is what is going on in the attempt to decenter wholly, to render Black Lives Matter as entirely secular. What is being done there, because it isn't, right? But there's tension in the midst there. And what's interesting also is that black religious male leadership has been decentered. So Jesse got booed.
See, I think that's the point.
Good, but can I say something though? Because the account of the freedom movement is as wholly or even centrally figured in churches, I think is a real mischaracterization.
Wrong.
Schools, civic organizations. I mean, if you look at SNCC is students, right? Sit-ins are students, right? I mean, teachers are sending kids out in the Children's Crusade in Birmingham. So even the narrative of the movement as being about church is about setting up the seclension narrative. It's about creating a sanitized version in the voice of a single charismatic male leader. I mean, just as an example, after the March on Washington, King isn't the person who's on the cover of Time and Life. It's A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin, right? So even the nation knows at the moment, right? Even the large knows that it's not about the churches, right? And so I think what happens, I think the flip side of that is, while this movement isn't wholly unchurched, that one wasn't wholly churched either.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think in some ways the black church serves as a proxy for a critique of other stuff, right? So when people say we're rejecting, it's not, because you're right, the church is as pervasive, perhaps as ever, but the idea is that we're going to reject male-centered leadership. We're going to reject charismatic leadership. We're going to reject the church as a kind of primary physical space that we're going to be in. We're going to embrace these ideologies that are linked to the church, or rather, we're going to reject this idea of we're going to reject homophobia. We're going to reject transphobia. We're going to reject this very central race-driven model, all of which is linked unfairly, to be sure, to the church. And so it's like, by saying we're rejecting the church or booing Jesse. Well, Jesse might not be a proxy. They might actually been booing Jesse, but
he got booed.
I was there. No, they was just booing Jesse.
He was trying to raise an offering.
$50. That's when they started.
He was trying to raise an offering, right?
But the church, I think, becomes a proxy for some other stuff. Yeah, it was booing there. Yeah.
Yes.
Oh my God, no. Hello, I'm Sally, and I am a postdoc at the Woodrow Wilson School. And this is actually directly related to what you were saying, Professor Perry, about the role of schools. Mm-hmm. And so when we think about the 50s, the 40s, the 60s, we think about education, public schools and education policy in particular around integration and so on and so forth as critical and central to achieving like racial equality. Mm-hmm. So I guess I'm interested today when we think about public schools and specifically their closure, right? In black and brown communities, you know, right there in Newark, 90% of the schools closed are affecting black and brown communities. Mm-hmm. What really is the role today in the movement for achieving equality of the public school system? I just feel like it's not talked about very much in these conversations.
Yeah. And
you have.
It's complicated, right? Because what we're witnessing now is the destruction of public education, period. And so, and there's a poignancy to it because at least in the southern states, right, public education only happens because newly emancipated black folks fight for it. The South didn't have a public school education system. And so there's this intensive struggle for the very existence of schools, right? And now privatization, right, in various forms is displacing. Then there's this other question of inequality in education, which is a different question, but the existence of public education is a necessary but insufficient piece of achieving equality, right? So part of what happens is, particularly in communities where schools are heavily under-resourced, Black folks are just looking for opportunities for their kids and want to send their children elsewhere, right, because of the depth of inequality. But that elsewhere is often part of the engine of privatization, right? But I think the other essential piece when we look, and I think it's really important to tell the way that we tell the story, right? And I talk about this in my classes all the time, the story of the road to Brown for Black communities, and Derek Bell discussed this brilliantly, was about equalization of resources. It was not about integration, right? Until the NAACP decides to do a pivot. Derek Bell says we failed the communities that we were working on behalf of as a result of making that pivot. But what you had is you actually had an entire community structure around education. So you had national teachers organizations, local teachers organizations, you had shared curriculum, you had the Journal of Negro Education, which was teaching people. And the leading Black intellectuals were all involved in K-12 education. Du Bois was going to education meetings, James Weldon Johnson, right? So there's both the existence of public education, but you have this tightly networked community of educators devoted to the outcomes for Black children, right? All of that is eviscerated in the aftermath of integration. And now the potential for it is being destroyed even further by the loss of the public sector. We have to talk about it. But there's so many steps, and I'm actually increasingly inclined towards thinking about structures for out-of-school learning for Black communities, because we are caught in so many ways. We have to fight for our schools. That's important. I think we have to lend ourselves to the struggles that people have in local communities to fight for keeping their schools open. But we also have to think about other types of institutions to do the kind of work that set the stage for the mid-20th century movement.
I agree. I think Imani really hit the nail on the head. But I think that's exactly right. I think there are the decline of the public in general. As Imani said, it really speaks to the issue here, right? That suddenly either school vouchers, all these sort of so-called choice options lead us down this road toward privatization. Even the charter schools, as they're understood now, is very different than how they were, as you know, constructed to be. They were supposed to be these laboratories of experimentation that would then be brought back to more traditional public schools so that everyone would have access to them. And now they're becoming an end in of themselves. And a lot of times private capital is driving these publicly funded institutions, and as such they become de facto private schools, but often ones that don't offer everyday people the kind of educational options and resources that they want. And so you end up with people still having bad schools, and in many ways, and then people who are left in traditional public schools are left even more vulnerable. People with two parents, people who are middle class, those are the first ones to leave traditional public schools and go to these other models. And so people who are left in the old public school now have fewer resources, fewer teachers. Studies show that when you have people of these different backgrounds and also educational levels, it makes everyone learn better. There's nothing to pull people up anymore, and so that hurts. The funding leaves. So all the people with who have special needs, people who have different learning needs, all those people are left in the school with fewer resources. And also, there's also obviously the breakdown of teachers' unions and all the kind of. This movement actually really breaks down organized labor in a very substantive way. There's also a change in the discourse around what I think how we assess what a good school is, right? There's the fact that schools aren't quote unquote good anymore. There's that issue. There's the issue that outside educational spaces, out of school learning spaces are declining. That's also incredibly important, as Imani pointed out, because we've always had them. And now the school is playing a greater and greater role at the same time that it's less and less resourced and prepared to do so. And then on top of that, we have this language of authority, standardization, and accountability, all of which are now shaped by these different logics that mean something very different than what they originally intended to mean. So what's standards has become standardization. And so these one-size-fits-all models of education for our community. So no one doesn't want standards in education, right? I've never made anyone say we don't want standards, right? But standards has become standardization, and so you have scripted curriculum, one-size-fits-all models like Success for All become the way that we measure whether a school has been successful or not. And so, because the idea is that
resources are taken away,
and then the resources are taken away, and that's part of the de-skilling process as well of teachers, right? So they say, well, we don't have as much resources, so we'll give you a scripted curriculum so that anybody can do it. Teaching becomes a procedural act as opposed to an intellectual practice. And so you give a teacher a script, they read it, they do it, they keep going. As a result of that, we don't speak to people's particular needs. We don't speak to people's cultural orientation. We don't speak to people's developmental space. And as a result, school isn't serving what we need because we have a particular idea of standards. Accountability becomes another way, it's like secret agent talk for just high-stakes testing everywhere. And so we say we're going to hold people accountable. Again, nobody doesn't want their schools to be held accountable. No parent in any hood in America said, you know what, I don't want schools to be held accountable. The question is, what does that look like? It used site-based selection of principals. What do you call it? Authentic assessments of students, having you do a task, right? I mean, thinking Dewey. I mean, think about Dewey talking about think about schools and society or democracy and education. Dewey sort of wrestling with the child and curriculum, thinking through all these different ways. He said, I wanted a psychologized experience, right? I don't want it to be purely child-centered where children just have whims and impulses and they go everywhere, like he says, and how we think, and I don't want, I don't want it to be purely teacher-centered where you just come in and just learn a bunch of stuff that you come in knowing based on preset scripts. It should be responsive to your lived experience. It should be responsive to your life, and it should be a training ground for democratic participation. You can't do any of that if you have a one-size-fits-all model that's speaking to a high-stakes test, which then gives you resources or not. And that's why it's a high-stakes test. So if you do well, your school gets more money. If you don't, you get less money. You get fewer resources. They might close down the school. It's really counterintuitive, right? If you're doing poorly, we'll give you less resources. So all this happens. And we normalize it because we're used to having measurement and assessment and competition as the index of whether school is doing well. So the market logic begins to shape the educational process. We're going to measure whether you're doing well or not. And if you don't make AYP, adequate yearly progress, you lose your thing. And we frame that as a George Bush project. It's really a Clinton project, once again.
And a more aggressive Obama project.
Exactly.
He doubled down on it.
They all doubled because Success for All is, again, a market-based solution. Not Success for All, Race to the Top is a market-based solution. And then finally, we have authority. Again, everybody wants teachers to have authority in some level, some space, right? But authority has become authoritarianism. So that schools become more and more framed around a model of disciplining the body for prison. Right, exactly. It's all becomes this very narrow. I mean, you look how much money we spent more money in surveillance equipment in schools than prisons in the last 10 years. It's a very particular approach, right? I always say you walk into a school, it takes you 20 minutes to get in because you're getting searched and prodded, they're looking at you, they're surveilling you, got parole officer, probation officer, school officer, cameras, locker search, fingerprint search. Take you 20 minutes to get into school, and then when you get in, don't nobody stop you from leaving, right? Like, all the money we spend is on the front end getting in. Once you get in, they don't care. Right? So there's a way in which we have doubled down on this because people want safe schools. Every parent, educational achievement is second. First thing is we want our kids to come home with all the body parts they left home with. We want them to be safe, we want them to be healthy, but they use that as a pretext for militarizing school space. And that becomes a very dangerous thing. And so when kids are militarized, they don't learn, right? But they don't have to learn if there's nothing but a preset test that they're playing to. And remember, while all this is happening, is the last thing I'll say, the humanities is getting stripped away. Arts education is getting stripped away. Music is getting stripped away. Literally, they're preparing people for the test. So the test doesn't become a means of assessing. The test becomes the end in of itself. So the kids aren't learning who they're supposed to be. They're not learning how to be citizens. They're not learning much of what they need. And quite frankly, that's the stuff that makes you less vulnerable. When kids have arts and music and after school and sports, they're less likely to drop out. They're less likely to get HIV/AIDS. They're less likely to commit suicide. They're less likely to get pregnant. They're less likely to go to jail. But we don't do that stuff. We know what works, but we don't have the political will to do so because we're still caught up in this kind of framework. So for me, that means we have to organize, once again. We need to, on a local level, we can join teachers boards, we can join teachers unions, we can organize labor, we can fight, but we need a political agenda and political education to lay out what these things are that we need. And we're not going to all agree on what those things are. I'm not suggesting that there's some unified vision, but at least we need to organize towards some vision of schooling and education, which I think is far less linked to markets and market values than they are at this particular historical junction.
I think we just got the signal from Dion.
I feel bad because I came late. Can we take one more question?
Yeah.
She can wait, and I don't want to be responsible for you not getting your question answered. I won't sleep tonight. Well.
Hi, my name is Jahi.
Right, exactly. But I won't enjoy it.
So my question is related to police brutality. And before Black Lives Matter, I think the last time there was a national conversation brutality was surrounding the police attacks on the Occupy encampments. And I've been thinking about how there hasn't really been too much discussion linking those two things. So I wanted to get your takes on that idea.
BLM?
The police brutality exercised against Occupy.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, connecting those two things and how that connection might get at more like the nature of the institution itself.
Younger would have been really
I know, I'm
good
sitting
for
there
that
thinking,
question.
I'm thinking back to the book, yeah.
Yeah, she would have been great to answer that. I don't know. I mean, I think the reason it's interesting. The Occupy BLM distinction is really interesting, right? And I do think that we can say that part of what Kianga talks about is that the sort of the danger of exceptionalizing Black experience to such an extent that we think that we can do justice all by ourselves. So the connection needs to be forged. At the same time, there's not the same degree of violence, right? And certainly not the same degree of indiscriminate, ritualized violence that's not about movement, but just about the fact of Blackness. And so, I mean, I part of what I think is interesting about Occupy is that the response to it and the diminishment of it, in some ways, I think we should think of it, its function is disciplining white young people out of a politics of identification with all kinds of people who are marginalized and suffering, right? And we don't talk that much about it, but there's a lot of work that's done in our culture and oftentimes in very deliberate ways to discipline young white people to align themselves with whiteness as opposed to humanness.
And, just to kind of channel Kianga in this instance, many of the people in Zuccotti Park who felt the brunt of police brutality, many of them were jailed, many of them were sentenced. And she puts it in this way: Black people bear the burden of police brutality, but we all bear the problem. We'll experience the problem of police brutality, right? We bear the burden of it, but the problem belongs to all of us. So you think it's just us, but it's going to touch you, right? And she uses, I think, and I don't want to speak for her here, but she uses Zuccotti Park and Occupy as an example of precisely that we think that the problem of police brutality is a problem just for Black folk, but the way policing takes place broadly will affect the country at large, right? And that becomes a great example of that.
Thank you all.
So can we thank you, and thank you, Marc. So there are books for sale. Some of you have already purchased books, but there are books for sale out there. Marc is going to set up out there, and we got him a nice Sharpie, and he's signing books if he's interested.
That's it. Yep.
There you go, Doc. I'm not. I'm so tired of signing books.
Man.
Cornell told us he just broke his own record. He signed 1,130 books in one night, in one sitting.